The oak door of the Green Valley Ag and Implement dealership groaned on its hinges, a sound Jedediah Stone knew as well as the caw of the crows in his own woodlot. It was a sound that hadn't changed in 30 years, but everything else had. The air inside no longer smelled of oil and honest steel. It smelled of fresh paint, cheap coffee, and the cloying scent of vinyl from the new office chairs. Behind a sprawling metal desk, a desk far too large for the papers shuffled upon it, sat Richard Davies. Rich, as he insisted everyone call him, hadn't earned the calluses on his hands. He'd inherited the dealership from his father, a man Jed had respected, a man who had understood the land and the men who worked it. Rich looked up from his paperwork, a pen tucked behind his ear, his smile as wide and shallow as a mud puddle after a sun shower. "Jed, good to see you. What can I do for you today? Need a new set of points for that old two-cylinder you keep around?" He chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling in a tin can. Jed stood there, his shadow long in the morning sun, slanting through the big plate-glass window. He wore his usual work clothes, denim overalls faded to the color of a summer sky, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, and boots caked with the rich black soil of his bottomland fields. He held his dusty felt hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, a habit he'd had since he was a boy. "I need tractors, Rich," Jed said, his voice low and steady. It was the voice of a man who didn't waste words. Rich leaned back in his squeaking chair, the vinyl sighing under his weight. "Tractors, huh? Well, you came to the right place. Got a brand new 4430 on the lot, just came in. Air conditioning, radio, sound guard cab. It's a real Cadillac of the cornfield. We can get you set up with financing. Have you in the seat by this afternoon?" Jed shook his head slowly. "Not one. I need 6. The squeaking of the chair stopped. Rich sat forward, his smile tightening at the corners. He glanced out the window at Jed's truck, a 20-year-old Ford F-100 with more rust than paint, parked next to a row of gleaming new green and yellow machines. 6? What in the world do you need 6 new tractors for, Jed? You planning on plowing the whole county?" "I'm replacing my fleet," Jed stated simply. 2 4630s, 2 4430s, and 2 2640s for the lighter work. Standard drawbar, dual hydraulics, power shift on the big ones, nothing fancy. Rich let out a short, sharp laugh. He stood up and walked over to the coffee pot, pouring himself a mug. He didn't offer Jed one. "Jed, that's a hell of an order. We're talking about $250,000 worth of iron right there." "More, probably. The bank's going to want to see a whole lot of paperwork for a loan that size. Your financials, your expansion plans." "I won't be needing the bank," Jed said, his eyes fixed on the younger man's back. Rich turned around, a flicker of disbelief, then amusement in his eyes. "What's that?" "I'm paying cash." The silence that followed was thick enough to plow. Rich stared at Jed, his mouth slightly agape. He looked Jed up and down, from his worn-out boots to his weathered face, as if seeing him for the first time. The amusement in his eyes curdled into suspicion, then condescension. "Cash?" Rich finally sputtered, setting his mug down with a clatter. "Jed, nobody pays cash for a line of equipment like that. Nobody. It doesn't make a good business sense. You leverage the bank's money. You write off the interest. You keep your capital liquid for seed, fertilizer, operating expenses. That's how modern farming works." "I know how it works," Jed replied, his voice still even. "I also know what happens when the price of corn drops $1 and the interest rates double. I'm not interested in being a partner with the bank. I'm interested in buying 6 tractors." Rich walked back to his desk and sat down, adopting the patient tone one might use with a child. "Look, Jed, I appreciate you coming to me. I really do. but I can't in good conscience sell you that much equipment for cash. It's just not how we do things. Our financing packages are part of the deal. It's how we build relationships with our customers. It's better for you. It's better for us." Jed knew what that meant. It was better for Rich's bottom line. The kickbacks from the bank, the interest payments, the built-in service contracts. It was a web, and Rich wanted every farmer in the county caught in it. "So you're telling me," Jed said, stepping closer to the desk, his knuckles white on the brim of his hat, "that my money is no good here. I'm telling you that we should talk about a sensible financing plan," Rich said, his smile returning. But it was all teeth now. "Let's be realistic. A man who drives a truck like that, walking in here talking about $250,000 in cash, it sounds a little far-fetched, don't you think? I have a reputation to uphold. I can't just—" He trailed off, but the implication hung in the air, thick and foul as diesel exhaust. He thought Jed was a liar, a crazy old man wasting his time. Jed stood there for a long moment, the tick of the wall clock counting out the seconds. He looked past Rich, through the big window, at the line of new tractors shimmering in the sun. He'd spent the better part of 20 years saving for this day, selling off small parcels of timber, raising feeder calves on the side, living frugally while others built new houses and took vacations. He'd put every spare dollar into savings bonds and certificates of deposit, patiently waiting, biding his time. He had the money, all right. He had it in a cashier's check, folded neatly in the inside pocket of his overalls, a check drawn on the very bank Rich was so eager for him to become indebted to. He didn't pull it out. He didn't need to. He saw the finality in Rich Davies's eyes. It wasn't about the money, it was about control. Rich didn't want customers, he wanted subjects. Jed put his hat back on his head, pulling the brim down low. "I see," he said, his voice flat. "Thank you for your time, Rich." He turned and walked toward the door, his boot heels clicking on the clean linoleum floor. "Jed, wait!" Rich called after him, a hint of false concern in his voice. "Don't be like that. Let's just talk about 1/4/30. We can get you on a 5-year plan." Jed didn't stop. He pushed the old oak door open and stepped back out into the honest air, the smell of dust and distant hayfields a welcome relief. The door groaned shut behind him, sealing him off from the new world of farming he wanted no part of. He stood by his old Ford for a moment, his hand resting on the sun-warmed hood, and looked back at the dealership, at the name painted in bold green letters, Davies Age and Implement. Now, before I tell you what Jed did next, standing there in that gravel lot with a lifetime of savings in his pocket and a fire of indignation burning in his chest, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever been looked down on, been dismissed, because you chose the slow, steady, debt-free path when everyone around you was mortgaging their future for the latest and greatest thing? Have you ever had your quiet prudence mistaken for poverty or foolishness? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling Jed's story is going to resonate with more than a few of you. Jed drove home in a cloud of dust and quiet fury. The familiar rattle of the Ford's dashboard and the whine of its 3-speed transmission were a comfort, a connection to a world that made sense, a world where a man's word was his bond and cash was king. He turned off the county blacktop onto his own gravel lane, the tires crunching a rhythm that eased the tightness in his shoulders. The lane was lined with 100-year-old maple trees his grandfather had planted, their leaves just beginning to hint at the coming autumn. At the end of it stood his farm. Not a showplace, but a workspace. The barn, painted a faded but respectable red, was sound. The house, a simple white clapboard farmhouse, was clean and well kept, and the machine shed, a long, pole-frame building was his sanctuary. He parked the truck and walked not to the house, but to the shed. He slid the heavy door sideways, the rollers groaning on the track. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of grease, diesel, and earth. His machine sat in neat rows, old soldiers waiting for their orders. His 2 John Deere 4020s, a 66 and a 68, were the heart of the operation. Their paint was faded, their fenders were dented, but their 6-cylinder diesel hearts were strong. He knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every quirk of their synchro-range transmissions. He knew the precise way to feather the clutch on the 66 to keep it from grabbing, and he knew the 68 burned a quart of oil every 50 hours, a fact he simply accepted and accounted for. He ran a hand over the wide, flat fender of the 68. This was the tractor he'd been planning to replace first. The clutch had been slipping under a heavy load since spring ploughing. He'd babied it through planting, but he knew its time was coming. He'd hoped to avoid the job, to park it, and climb onto the seat of a new, air-conditioned 4630. Now, that wasn't an option. The job had to be done. The next morning, long before the sun had burned the dew off the alfalfa, Jed was in the shed. He positioned a heavy floor jack under the 4020's frame and used a set of wooden blocking to secure the front half of the tractor. The process of splitting a tractor of that size was a delicate, dangerous dance of mechanics and physics. One slip, one mistake, and thousands of pounds of cast iron could crush a man without a second thought. He methodically disconnected the electrical wiring, the fuel lines, the hydraulic hoses, and the steering linkages, tagging each one with a small piece of masking tape and a pencil marking. He drained the oil, the dark, thick fluid glugging into a wide pan, carrying with it the scent of 1,000 hours of hard work. Then came the heavy work. With a 3/4-inch drive socket set and a long breaker bar, he began loosening the bolts that held the engine to the transmission housing. They were stubborn, seized by years of heat, pressure, and rust. Each one surrendered with a painful, gunshot-like crack. His knuckles were raw, his back ached, but he worked with a steady, focused rhythm. He built a rolling stand out of heavy timbers and cast-iron wheels to support the rear half of the tractor. Finally, with everything disconnected and supported, he used a long pry bar to gently, carefully, inch by inch, separate the 2 halves of the green machine. The gap widened, revealing the dark, greasy heart of the tractor's powertrain. The clutch assembly, the pressure plate, the flywheel, all were now exposed to the light. The old clutch disc was worn down nearly to the rivets. The pressure plate was scored with heat marks, a testament to years of pulling a 5-bottom plough through heavy clay. He spent the rest of the day cleaning. He scraped away decades of caked-on grease and dirt with a putty knife and a wire brush. He used cans of brake cleaner to wash the flywheel until the machined surface shone, checking it for cracks or warping with a straight edge. He was meticulous. This wasn't just a repair, it was a recommitment. Every bolt he cleaned and torqued, every part he inspected and replaced, was a silent act of defiance against Rich Davies and his world of disposable, financed machinery. News travels fast in a small town, and the story Rich Davies told over coffee at the grain co-op was a good one. He painted a picture of old Jed Stone, his mind gone soft, coming in and demanding a fleet of tractors with imaginary money. People chuckled. They shook their heads. "Poor old Jed," they'd say. "Guess the sun's finally gotten to him." His neighbor to the west, Bill Jensen, was one of the first to give him grief. Bill had just traded for a new International Harvester 1066, a beautiful red tractor with a gleaming white cab. He'd financed it to the hilt through Davies, along with a new 6-row planter. He saw Jed wrestling with the split 4020 in his shed as he drove by. He pulled his shiny new pickup into Jed's lane. "Having some trouble there, Jed," Bill called out, leaning on his truck door with a smirk. "Just some routine maintenance," Jed grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand. "Routine maintenance?" Bill laughed. "Looks to me like that old girl's given up the ghost. Heard you were down at Davies trying to buy out the whole lot. You should have just let him finance you one of these new ones. Power steering, AC. I was planting beans till 10 o'clock last night listening to the radio. You can't do that when you're busy turning wrenches on a museum piece." "This museum piece is paid for, Bill," Jed said quietly, turning back to his work. "Can you say the same for that radio?" Bill's smirk faded. He muttered something under his breath and got back in his truck, spinning his tires in Jed's gravel as he left. The encounter left a sour taste in Jed's mouth. It wasn't just Bill. It was a feeling in the air, a sense of pity from some, scorn from others. He was the old man who didn't get it, the farmer who was being left behind by progress. He was a relic, just like his tractors. But as he carefully aligned the new clutch disc with a pilot tool and began the slow, arduous process of rejoining the two halves of the 4020, he felt a grim satisfaction. Let them talk, let them laugh. His fate was in his own two hands, not in a folder on a banker's desk. The early 70s rolled in like a warm front, bringing with them a season of unbelievable prosperity for the American farmer. The massive grain deal with the Soviet Union sent crop prices into the stratosphere. Corn that had been $2 a bushel was suddenly fetching $3, then $4. Soybeans followed suit. It was a gold rush in the corn belt, and the mantra echoing from every co-op and auction house was "get big or get out." Land prices, which had been stable for a generation, doubled and then tripled in the span of a few years. A fever gripped the heartland. No one rode the crest of that wave higher than Rich Davies. His dealership became the epicenter of the boom. Farmers, flush with cash from high grain prices and drunk on the promise of ever-increasing land values, lined up to sign his financing papers. He couldn't get new equipment in fast enough. He sold massive John Deere 86-30 four-wheel drives, the articulated beasts that could pull an 8-bottom plow and work around the clock. He sold Gleaner and John Deere combines with 6- and 8-row corn heads, machines that could harvest in a day what used to take a week. His lot was a revolving door of shiny new iron. Rich himself was transformed. He tore down the old dealership his father had built and erected a massive steel building with a glass-fronted showroom, a 20-bay service center, and plush air-conditioned offices. He bought a new Cadillac Eldorado every year. He and his wife started taking winter vacations to Florida. But most significantly, he started buying land. Using the dealership as leverage, he secured massive loans and began buying up farms from older men who were ready to retire, or from younger men who had overextended themselves and failed. He didn't work the land himself, of course. He hired managers and operators, equipping them with the biggest and best machinery from his own dealership, a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of debt and profit. To the community, he was the model of modern success, a visionary who saw the future and seized it. Meanwhile, Jed Stone kept his head down and his hands dirty. He watched the frenzy with a deep-seated skepticism that had been passed down from his father and his grandfather. He knew the land, and he knew the markets, and he knew that no tree grows to the sky. He sold his corn and beans at the peak of the market, just like everyone else. But what he did with the money was radically different. His neighbors used their windfall profits as down payments on more land, borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars at escalating interest rates to expand their empires. They tore down old barns to put up massive grain bins, all bought on credit. They bought new pickups, new boats, new everything. Jed took his profits and walked into the bank. He didn't talk to a loan officer. He went straight to the president, old Mr. Abernathy, a man who still wore a tie every day and remembered the Great Depression. Jed sat across the wide mahogany desk and paid off the remaining balance on his farm's mortgage. It wasn't much, but it was the last dollar he owed anyone on this earth. When he was done, his farm, all 480 acres of it, the house, the barns, the soil his family had tilled for 3 generations, was his, free and clear. The rest of the money he put away. Not in the stock market, not in speculative land deals, but in the safest, most boring investments he could find, treasury bonds and high-interest certificates of deposit. To his neighbors, it was an act of madness. Bill Jensen cornered him at the feed store one afternoon. "Jed, what are you thinking?" Bill asked, his face a mixture of genuine confusion and pity. "Land's going for $4,000 an acre. You could buy that 80 next to your place, leverage your equity. In 5 years, you'll have doubled your money. You're just sitting on that cash while it's losing value to inflation every day. The only land I'm interested in is the land under my own feet," Jed replied calmly. "And I'm not sitting on cash, Bill. I'm sleeping on it, and I sleep pretty well." Bill just shook his head and walked away. The word was out. Jed Stone had lost his nerve. He'd had his one big chance to get ahead, to become a major player, and he'd choked. He was content to be a small-timer, a relic tinkering with his ancient 4020s while the world passed him by. He still did all his own repairs, still wore his faded overalls, still drove his rusty Ford truck. In an era of explosive growth and conspicuous consumption, his quiet, debt-free discipline looked like abject failure. One crisp evening in the late 70s, Jed stood on his back porch, sipping a cup of coffee as the sun went down, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. His corn was in the bin, his soybeans were sold. The farm was quiet, resting. He felt a deep sense of peace, a satisfaction that went bone deep. But then, a sound drifted across the fields from the west, from Bill Jensen's farm. It was the deep, throaty roar of a big diesel engine, the sound of Bill's new International 1466, its turbocharger whistling as it pulled a massive chisel plow through the corn stubble, its cab lights cutting bright swaths through the growing darkness. Bill was fall plowing, getting a jump on next spring, pushing hard, always pushing. Jed listened to the sound of that powerful, bank-owned engine working late into the night. That same week, he'd heard a man on the radio in his workshop, a man with a deep, serious voice. He was the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a fellow named Paul Volcker. He was talking about inflation, calling it a great evil that had to be stamped out, no matter the cost. He spoke of tightening the money supply and raising interest rates. Jed didn't understand all the economic theory, but he understood the words interest rates. They were a farmer's silent partner, or his silent executioner. A cold breeze rustled the dry leaves in the maple trees. The roar of Bill's tractor seemed to grow louder, more desperate in the twilight, and for the first time in a long time, Jed Stone felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coming autumn. He had a feeling the world was about to change, and the piper, who had been playing such a sweet tune for so long, was finally coming around to be paid. The summer of '79 came in hot and stayed that way. The sky over Green Valley turned a pale, hazy blue and clamped down like the lid on a canning jar. The corn, which had shot up tall and proud in the wet spring, began to suffer. Its broad leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, giving the fields a spiky, wounded look. Ponds shrank, their muddy edges cracking into intricate mosaics, and the creaks slowed to a trickle. The deep, resonant roar of big, turbocharged tractors working late into the night was replaced by an anxious silence, broken only by the buzz of cicadas. It was in this tense, waiting quiet that the first real crack appeared, and it started, as Jed might have guessed, on Bill Jensen's farm. Jed was mending a fence along their property line when he saw Bill's big International 1466 sitting dead in the middle of a half-ploughed field. A day passed, then 2. On the 3rd day, a gleaming white service truck from Davies Ag and Implement rolled down Bill's lane. Jed watched from a distance as a young mechanic in a clean uniform spent hours with his head under the tractor's hood, a toolbox full of specialized equipment spread out on the ground. Later that evening, Bill's pickup rattled into Jed's yard. His face, usually ruddy and confident, was pale and drawn. He didn't get out of the truck, just idled by the machine shed where Jed was greasing the fittings on his old Gleaner combine. "Heard anything about a grain embargo?" Bill asked without preamble, his voice flat. Jed stopped turning the grease gun handle. "Just what's on the radio. President Carter's stopping all sales to the Soviets." Bill swore, a low, bitter sound. "Prices dropped 30 cents a bushel this morning, 30 cents, and they're saying it's just the start." He hit his steering wheel with the palm of his hand. "On top of that, the turbos shot on the 1466. Davies wants $4,000 for a new one, plus labor. Says it's a special order. Might take 2 weeks to get it in." Jed wiped his hands on a rag. "That's a steep price." "Steep? It's robbery." Bill's voice cracked. "And Rich, he was different. Said he couldn't put it on my account. Said with the market like it is, all major repairs are cash on the barrelhead. Cash? Who's got 4,000 in cash lying around right before harvest?" Jed didn't answer. He just looked at his neighbor, a man who had mocked his old, paid-for machinery, a man now trapped by the very progress he had championed. The new tractor, with its complex, high-performance engine, was a marvel when it ran. But when it broke, it held its owner hostage. It couldn't be fixed with a wrench and common sense in your own shop. It required a specialist, proprietary parts, and a dealer who held all the cards. The cracks in Rich Davies's empire began to show not as a great collapse, but as 1,000 tiny fractures. The easy credit dried up. The friendly, backslapping demeanor he'd perfected was replaced by a strained, almost predatory intensity. Farmers who were a few weeks late on a payment received sharp, demanding letters. The once bustling service bays at his dealership grew quiet. He'd laid off his 2 best senior mechanics, men who knew the old 2-cylinders as well as the new Soundguard cabs, and kept only the younger, cheaper parts changers. His inventory of new equipment, the massive 4-wheel drives and 20-foot disc plows, sat gathering dust, their tires slowly losing air. The boom was over, and Rich was leveraged to the absolute limit. He'd bet the farm, dozens of farms in fact, on the belief that the good times would last forever. Jed saw it most clearly one Saturday morning at the co-op. Rich was there, not holding court by the coffee pot as usual, but in a tense, hushed conversation with Mr. Abernathy, the bank president. Rich's face was ashen, and he gestured wildly with his hands. Mr. Abernathy just stood there, his arms crossed, shaking his head slowly. The visionary, the king of Green Valley agriculture, looked like a man pleading for his life. Jed turned away, feeling not a shred of satisfaction, only a deep, weary sorrow. He knew what was coming. The whole county was a dry field, and the lightning was on the horizon. The lightning strike came not from the sky, but from Washington, D.C. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, determined to slay the dragon of inflation, cranked interest rates to levels not seen in living memory. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything, climbed past 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. For the farmers who had borrowed heavily on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. An operating loan that cost 8% interest 1 year suddenly cost 20. Mortgage payments on land bought for $4,000 an acre more than doubled, while the price of that same land collapsed by half. The wave of foreclosures that swept the heartland was a silent, brutal tsunami. It wasn't just farms, it was the businesses that depended on them. The feed stores, the small-town cafes, the hardware shops, and of course the farm implement dealerships. Rich Davies was wiped out. His entire business model had been a house of cards built on 3 aces: high commodity prices, rising land values, and low interest rates. When all 3 cards were pulled from the bottom of the deck at once, the whole thing came crashing down. The bank, which had so eagerly financed his expansion, just as quickly called in his loans. He couldn't pay. His customers, facing their own bankruptcies, couldn't pay him. It was a domino cascade of financial ruin. One cold November morning, Jed drove into town to pick up a hydraulic filter. When he pulled up to Davies Ag and Implement, he stopped his truck in the middle of the road. A large, stark white sign had been pounded into the lawn in front of the glass showroom. In severe black letters it read, "Public Auction, by order of Green Valley National Bank." Taped to the front door was a legal notice of foreclosure. Inside, the showroom was dark. The gleaming new tractors had been rearranged into neat, sterile rows by the auction company, each with a number taped to its windshield. The life had gone out of the place. It was a tombstone marking the death of an era. While his neighbors were drowning, Jed Stone was treading water. He wasn't thriving, not by any means. The low grain prices and high fuel costs hurt him just like everyone else. But the crucial difference was, he owed nothing. The land was his. The machines were his. His biggest expenses were fuel, seed, and fertilizer, which he paid for with the modest profits from the previous year's crop. He didn't have a single interest payment to make. His old 4020s, which had been objects of ridicule just a few years before, became his salvation. When a fuel injector line on the 60R6 began to leak, he didn't have to call a dealer. He drove his Ford into town, bought a new steel line and 2 compression fittings for $12 at the auto parts store, and fixed it himself in under an hour. When the alternator failed on the 68, he pulled one from a junked pickup truck in his grove and made it fit. He kept his machines running with ingenuity, baling wire, and the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent with his hands on the iron. His moment of quiet vindication came one afternoon during soybean harvest. The weather had turned, and a big rainstorm was forecast for the next day. Every farmer was in a frantic race to get their beans out of the field. As Jed was making his last round, he saw Bill Jensen's new red combine sitting motionless at the far end of his field, a plume of black smoke hanging over it. Jed finished his own field, dumped his last load in the grain truck, and drove his old Gleaner F combine down the road and into Bill's lane. He found Bill sitting on the ground, his head in his hands, covered in grease and despair. "The main hydraulic pump went," Bill said, his voice hollow. "Just quit. Won't lift the head, won't turn the reel. Nothing. Called the dealer in the next county. Davies's is already shut down. They said they might be able to get a guy out here in a day or 2. The beans will be ruined by then." Jed just nodded. "Unhook your grain head." Bill looked up, confused. "What?" "Unhook it. My F isn't big enough to lift that 6-row head of yours, but it'll handle your old 4-row, won't it?" Bill's old, smaller grain head was sitting on a trailer behind his machine shed, covered in a dusty tarp. It was the one he'd kept from the combine he'd traded in to Rich Davies years ago. An hour later, with Bill's old head mounted on Jed's old combine, the two men worked side by side into the darkness, illuminated by the combine's headlights. Jed ran the machine, its simple, rattling mechanics a familiar comfort, while Bill drove the grain truck. They finished just as the first cold drops of rain began to fall. When the last of the beans were augured into the truck, Bill walked over to the combine, his face streaked with dust and tears. He couldn't speak for a moment. "Jed, Why?" "Because you're my neighbor, Bill," Jed said, shutting down the old Alice Chalmers engine. "And the rain was coming. It's as simple as that." He didn't mention the years of mockery. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't have to. The truth of his philosophy was there for all to see, chugging away reliably in a field of broken promises. The day of the auction was grey and cold, with a raw wind that bit at the faces of the men gathered in the dealership's gravel lot. The crowd was a somber collection of farmers, local businessmen, and bargain hunters, their faces etched with the anxiety of the times. They were there to witness a funeral, and perhaps pick over the bones. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice a hypnotic, rhythmic chant that sliced through the wind. He started with the small things: racks of filters, barrels of oil, tool chests, shop presses. Each item was sold for a fraction of its worth. Jed stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, just watching. He saw Rich Davies standing off to one side, near the building, looking like a ghost at his own wake. His fancy suit was gone, replaced by a thin jacket and worn-out work pants. His face was gaunt, his eyes vacant. He was watching the dismemberment of his father's legacy, piece by painful piece. Then the auctioneer moved to the big-ticket items, the remaining tractors and combines. They too went for pennies on the dollar, bought by speculators from out of state. The local farmers, the ones who needed them, could only watch. They had no cash, and their credit was shot. Finally, the auctioneer cleared his throat. "All right, folks, now we come to the main event. We are selling the real estate and the business itself, the building, the land it sits on, and the franchise agreement. A turnkey operation, ladies and gentlemen." He started the bidding high. A silence fell over the crowd. The price was too steep for anyone there. The auctioneer dropped his price. Then again. Finally, a low bid came from a man in a suit near the front, a lawyer representing the bank. He was there to buy it back for the bank if no other credible offers emerged. "I have $50,000 from the bank," the auctioneer chanted. "Do I hear 60? 50,000 going once, going twice?" From the back of the crowd, a calm, steady voice said, 60,000. Every head turned. It was Jed Stone. A murmur went through the crowd. Rich Davies looked up, his eyes focusing on Jed for the first time, a flicker of disbelief and confusion in their depths. The bank's lawyer, looking annoyed, immediately bid 70. 80, Jed said, his voice unchanged. He hadn't moved a muscle. The lawyer conferred with a man next to him, then bid 85. 100,000, Jed said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. A gasp went through the crowd. This was real money, especially now. The lawyer looked stunned. He shook his head. The auctioneer's eyes widened. He looked at Jed, then at the lawyer. "I have $100,000. Do I hear 110? 100,000 going once, going twice." He slammed his gavel down on the lectern, the crack echoing off the steel building. "Sold for $100,000 to the man in the overalls." Jed didn't smile. He simply walked toward the trailer to sign the papers and hand over the cashier's check he'd been carrying for nearly a decade. A week later, the dealership was quiet. Jed was inside, sweeping the dusty floors of the showroom, when the door creaked open. It was Rich Davies. He looked even worse than he had at the auction. I just came to get my father's old desk," Rich stammered, not meeting Jed's eyes. "The auctioneer said the buyer let it stay." "It's still in the office," Jed said, leaning on his broom. Rich shuffled into the office and stood before the sprawling metal desk where he had once refused Jed's cash. He struggled to move it. "It's heavy," Jed said, walking over. "Here." Together, the two men wrestled the heavy desk out into the showroom. They stood there in an awkward silence. "What are you going to do, Jed?" Rich finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Tear it down?" "Nope," Jed said. "I'm going to open it back up." Rich looked at him, bewildered. "How? Nobody's buying. The business is dead." "The business of selling debt is dead," Jed corrected him gently. "The business of farming goes on. The business of fixing things goes on. There are hundreds of good, older machines in this county that just need parts and an honest mechanic to keep them running. That's the business I'm going to be in." He looked Rich straight in the eye. "I'm going to need a good parts man, someone who knows the books, and I'll need a mechanic's helper in the shop. The pay's not much to start, but it's an honest day's work." Rich stared at him, his mouth open, unable to comprehend. He was being offered a job, a menial job, in the business he had once owned, by the man he had once scorned. He saw no pity in Jed's eyes, no gloating, only a simple, straightforward offer. It was a chance, perhaps the only one he had left, to start over, to learn the value of work from the ground up. "The parts job," Rich said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll take the parts job." The sign painter came the next day. He scraped the words, "Davies Ag and Implement," off the big sign out front, and, in simple block letters, painted "Stone's Farm Service." The change was more than just a name. The glass showroom was no longer filled with massive million-dollar machines. Instead, Jed lined the walls with shelves of filters, bearings, belts, and hydraulic hoses. He brought in a heavy-duty press and a lathe and set up a proper machine shop in the back. The dealership transformed from a place that sold new iron to a place that gave old iron new life. And the farmers came back, first one by one, then in a steady stream. They came for a water pump for a 30-20, for a clutch for a gleaner, for advice on how to time an old diesel. They came because Jed Stone knew what he was talking about. He charged a fair price, and he'd let a man run a tab until his crop came in. He became the anchor of the community, the quiet, steady center that held things together while the economic storm raged. Rich Davies, humbled and quiet, worked the parts counter, learning the dignity of a day's labor and the grace of a second chance. Years passed. The farm crisis slowly receded. Prices recovered. The land healed. Jed never went back to full-time farming. He hired a good young man to run his land and devoted himself to the dealership. He never got rich. He still drove his old Ford truck until the floorboards rusted through. He never took a vacation to Florida. One afternoon, many years later, Jed, now an old man with silver hair and hands permanently stained with the memory of grease, was in the shop. He was standing beside a young man named Tom, the son of the farmer he'd hired to run his place, a boy he'd mentored since he was old enough to hold a wrench. They were bent over the open engine of an old 40-20 that had been brought in for an overhaul. "Now you see this little line here on the flywheel," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed with a gnarled finger. "You have to line that up perfectly with the mark on the housing. That's top dead center. If you're one tooth off on that injection pump gear, she'll either never start or she'll knock herself to pieces." Tom nodded, his young face a mask of concentration. "It's complicated. It's precise," Jed corrected him. "But it's knowable. You can understand it. You can hold it in your own 2 hands." He straightened up, his back aching, and looked around the busy shop, at the lathes turning, at the welders sparking, at the farmers talking over coffee by the parts counter. He looked at the young man beside him, a new generation learning the old ways. His legacy wasn't the acreage he owned, or the money in his bank account. It was this place, this knowledge, this independence. "It's not about the iron, son," Jed said, putting a heavy hand on the young man's shoulder. "It was never about the iron. It's about what it represents, being your own man, owing nothing to anyone, being free. Every bolt you tighten, every part you fix, you're not just fixing a machine, you're buying yourself another piece of freedom." The young man looked from the old tractor to the old man's weathered face, and finally understood. The chugging rhythm of the diesel engines, the smell of steel and oil, the satisfying click of a socket wrench. It wasn't the sound of farming. It was the sound of liberty.